The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, a warm welcome to you all, wherever you're tuning in. What a year we've had. We're getting towards the end of it. I hope next year will be better. I'm sure we're all hoping the same thing, but it's, yeah, what a year. Look, I just want to do a sound check because it's always a good idea to do that. You'll notice if you're unfamiliar, over on the right-hand side, there's a little question box there. And if you open that up, and could I just ask you to write in the word clear or type in the word clear, would be even better. And that will just let us know that we're being heard. Thanks, Terry. Nice to see you again. Not that I can see you, but good to see you. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, John. Hi, Leona. How are you? Good to see you. If I can't see you, but good to hear from you at least. All right. Sounds like we're coming across loud and clear. Now, just a little housekeeping issue. If you've got a question, and we do ask you to ask questions, we do believe it's important. Unfortunately, we can't mute everybody because we've got a significant number of people online. So obviously, the topic is of great relevance to everyone. So we can't, hi Brett, we can't actually do that. So what we'll ask you to do is to type in your question. So type in your question whenever you're ready. Now we're going to leave a time for that later, but the thing is, when you think of the question, type it in. The reason for that is, of course, you won't forget it, and if we've got a recording of it, then we can deal with it in the time we'll have. So I'm going to do a couple of minutes introduction. I want to just let everyone know that I'm very, very pleased to be working with Mark Shaw today. Now, Mark is a very, very experienced HR manager at a very senior level. He's an author and he's a consultant who's got a wealth of experience. In fact, both of us, in many respects, think very much alike in relation to this whole issue of performance, and you'll probably pick that up as we go through today. For myself, I'm an author. I've been involved in this sort of business, particularly in the leadership and performance space, for quite a considerable amount of time, and written a few books about it. So I'll talk a little bit about some of my experience as we go. So welcome, everyone. Now, a lot of surveys say that 70% of people are disengaged at work, which, you know, it can be as high as 70%, which is pretty scary, which obviously means that only 30% of people would classify themselves as engaged. Now, that in itself is a huge issue. But we also know that when people are disengaged, or when they're not engaged, their performance suffers. And that's not an unusual thing, but we've seen it before. And so when their performance suffers, what we tend to do is we launch straight into a performance, or what we might call a PIP, a performance improvement program. And Mark's going to talk in more detail about that and some of the pitfalls of that. So we go through this legalistic process and put people through a process, and in actual fact, the issue is often that they're just not engaged. Now, engagement ebbs and flows. So we can be engaged today and not engaged tomorrow. But ultimately, you know, usually when we sit down with people and we go through this very stressful performance improvement process, often what happens, of course, is it's about engagement. So we want to challenge you with some of our beliefs about engagement, and just talk to you a little bit about how you might go about things a little bit different in terms of what you might do to get the best out of people. So we do know that research demonstrates clearly that if people are actually engaged, they're more productive. Now, that's probably not something that would surprise any of us, but it's important to know that the research demonstrates that. So obviously, the more engaged we can get people, the more likely it is that they're going to give that little extra discretionary effort that we're requiring at work. So in many respects, the problem is often an issue around engagement rather than an issue around performance. Obviously, performance suffers, but it might well be that we may need to look at engagement. Now, the important thing about engagement, and I want to make this point, and I know Mark agrees with me on this, that it's a two-way street. So the idea is, and of course, when you look at a lot of the HR journals and books, it talks about what we need to do as leaders. You know, we need to give free massages, or we need to give them this and we need to give them that. And all of a sudden things, obviously the person on the receiving end has an obligation to be engaged as well. So I want to make that point, that engagement is not just the province or responsibility of the leader. It's also, of course, about the individual. And so obviously there's only so far you can go with some of this. I mean, you can do incredible things on the engagement front and end up not finding somebody wanting to be engaged. So we want to make that point, because it's not all about what you do, but a lot of it can be about what you do. And we'll talk about what you can do, but ultimately the person on the receiving end, they've got to come to the realization that being engaged is part of their responsibility as well. There are some people, as we know, that go through life disengaged from day one in work. Unless you've won lotto or you've got a big inheritance, most of us work 40 years of our life. The trouble is, of course, that during that 40 years, a lot of people are actually disengaged all the way through, regardless of what happens. That's pretty sad, really, when you think about it. That's a big waste of time. But anyway, I must have a chip missing about that, because I never quite work out how someone can spend 40 years being completely disengaged. But the point is, that's a personal choice that they make. It's not a choice necessarily that the leader makes. But nevertheless, we want to talk about what leaders can do and what you might do to create the right environment by which people may choose to be engaged. Okay, so let's just talk about a couple of models that I think may be of interest to you. John Meyer put out a model of commitment, organisational commitment, and Mark's going to talk a little bit about the difference between engagement and performance. But ultimately, commitment is really about the commitment to the organisation. And of course, that's being challenged quite dramatically now in our day and age. How do we get people more committed to their employer? But ultimately, what Meyer said is there are 3 different ways that people can be committed to their organisation. And I think it's worth just reviewing this, because ultimately it might assist you if you're thinking about somebody in your organisation who you would classify as uncommitted at this stage. So we've got affective commitment, and that is they actually enjoy the workplace. So it might be, for example, in a not-for-profit, where people are actually working for a cause that they believe in strongly. That would be an example of affective commitment. Now, not all the work that we do is actually working towards a large cause that might be in a not-for-profit. So sometimes it's difficult to get affective commitment, because it might be an office-bound job where people are doing paperwork, or it might be an outdoor job where people are basically, doing things that perhaps most people would say are fairly boring and mundane. But certainly one level of commitment is they want to be there because they enjoy the challenge and the work that they do. Now, a leader can do a certain amount about that. Then we have continuance commitment. Now, this is probably the most negative of the 3 forms of commitment, but this is the commitment where people really can't afford to leave. Perhaps they've got certain benefits that accrue as a result of staying with that employer. And for example, in local government, when the mining industry was taking off, a lot of people stayed in local government, surprisingly, when they could have actually doubled their income. The reason for that is that they argued, and when I spoke to them about that, they'd say, well, I get a four-day fortnight, and whereas in the mining industry we don't. So that's the most negative form of commitment, because people just don't feel comfortable about leaving. But nevertheless, it is a form of commitment. So we've just got a couple of comments and questions here. I might just deal with, are we going to make the slides available? John, absolutely. You'll be getting a copy of the recording and you'll be getting a copy of the slides. So thank you for raising that. I appreciate that. Now, the final form of commitment is normative commitment, and that is where the boss is willing to invest some time and energy into the individual. So, for example, I'm teaching in an MBA program at QUT, and a lot of those organisations are willing to pay for people to go through a fairly lucrative course. And so there is a commitment there that the organisation's doing something to develop me, and as a result of developing me, I'm committed to the organisation. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. So that's a sort of a landscape of commitment. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit around the concept of work, because one of the things that fascinates me about work is that it's two-dimensional, but yet because we've got a job description, and you can see I've written a book on this, and you can probably imagine what my view is about job descriptions just from the title there. But if you think about work this way, it's two-dimensional. We've got a job role, and the job role is pretty much tied up in the job description. And that pretty much includes the technical aspects of what people should be doing in their day-to-day job. And as we all know, we've usually got a little legal disclaimer at the bottom of the job description that says any other duty deemed relevant by the leader or the manager. So in other words, you kind of think, well, why bother having a job description? If anything else is open to be included in their duty statement as such. And of course, we've got Dilbert-style jokes going on about job descriptions. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a work document. Of course we should. People need to know what they're doing. But the problem with the job description is it only covers one dimension of performance. Now, the other dimension of performance is what we call non-job roles. Now, academics have been looking at this for 25 years, and they've been arguing that there are non-job roles that are critically important to the success of people at work. In other words, they contribute to performance. But because they have argued that we can't really get a generic handle on that, I actually had a go at this, and I said, well, actually, there are 4 non-job roles that are critically important to anybody in any industry, anywhere. And if you think about these non-job roles, I'm sure you'd agree that they're critically important to the success of the work that people do in your organisation. Now, one of those roles is having a positive attitude and enthusiasm. Now, I don't expect people to be bouncing off the walls with excitement when they come to work. True enough, but I don't also expect people to come to work whinging, whining, complaining, playing politics, ducking for cover. All of those things are obviously costly to performance. And yet we don't really talk about that with people. And that really concerns me. And I guess we rationalise and say, well, 1, it isn't in the job description, and 2, maybe I'm going to be a little bit too subjective, or 3, maybe the person might get upset about it when I have a conversation with them about it. But the truth of the matter is, I could come into your organisation, or Mark could come into your organisation tomorrow, sit there for 20 minutes, and we could have a cup of tea with you, and we could work out who's got a positive attitude and who hasn't. In other words, we can all agree on those attributes. So it's not necessarily that subjective, but it's definitely, obviously, contributing to performance. It has to, because we know that a negative energy will rub off on other people. So that's one non-job description. Another one that we think is, or I think is critically important, is team role. Basically, we're all expected to work in teams now, and we will have to continue to do that. And some of those teams we work in are teams of people that we don't really know well, and perhaps we're only involved in the team for the duration of a project, and then we go back to our functional area. So we want people to be team players, and yet I've often come across people who have said, oh, well, I'm not really a team player. I just come to work, I do my job, and off I go. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't cut it, because at the end of the day, unless you're on a desert island on your own, you are going to be working with someone else, and you'll need to perform in a team environment. So that's critically important, but again, it's often not included on the work document we call a job description as such. A third one is a skill development role. We expect people to grow and develop continuously at work. And again, I often hear people say, well, I've been using this spreadsheet for a long time, or this process, and I really don't want to change. But the problem with that, of course, is that the world around us is changing so rapidly that if people aren't keeping up with their learning, then clearly they're going to be left behind. So it's not just a role that's critically important to the organisation, it's also important, of course, to the individual and their opportunities in employment. So we want people to upskill, multi-skill, and all the other type of skilling that goes on. Now, the final role that I think is critically important is the continuous improvement role, the innovation and continuous improvement role. Now, the skill development role is about developing self, whereas the innovation and continuous role is about developing the individual, the organisation. So we want people to come to work, not leave their brains in a paper bag at the doorway, come to work, contribute to how the place can be better, faster, easier, more productive, less waste, whole range of things there. So I wanted to just leave that with you to think about this, because the reality is that these things are critical to performance. Can you imagine having someone who's highly technically skilled, who has a rotten attitude, who's not a team player, who's not willing to grow and develop, and is not willing to contribute to making the organisation more efficient and effective? I would argue that that person is not being productive. So I just want to give you a little bit of context around non-job roles. And so the difference is role descriptions are important. Perhaps job descriptions are things that perhaps are one-dimensional. And I would argue that there are 5 roles that people play in organisations. There's a job role and 4 non-job roles. So we can talk a little bit about that a little later. Now, a lot of people say, well, what's the vehicle that we can use to actually have these conversations with people that may be development and performance-based? And I came up with the 5 conversations framework. Now, the 5 conversations framework, you can see in front of you there, looks at 5 conversations over 5 months. So the idea is that you'd sit down with each person over 5 months, once a month for about 15 minutes, and you talk about the themes of these, and so I'll just quickly run through those. So we have on month 1, we have a climate review conversation. Now, organisations spend thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, doing engagement surveys online. And I'm not arguing that they shouldn't be done, but often people get very cynical and probably don't like to contribute for the following year. Why don't we just have a conversation about these things? Why do we have to sort of do it online and then sort of bury the results somewhere if we don't like them? So we might start this conversation with, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, they might say 6, and you might then say, is that as good as it gets? And if they say no, then say, how do we get you from a 6 to a 7, and what can we do to do that? So these are tools of engagement that are critically important. The second conversation is around strengths and talents. Instead of us going straight for the jugular and talking about what people are no good at, let's start talking about what people are actually good at. Now, if you actually sat down with someone and said, what's your strength? They'll look at you in a very strange way and think, you know, what planet are you on? But if you actually said to someone, what's the one thing that you enjoy most about your work? Hopefully they'll have something to say. And whatever that might be, that is their strength, because we know from research there's a high correlation between what people enjoy and what they're good at. And that's a great way. And then, of course, the conversation is very much around how can we use this more in the work that you do, day to day, moment by moment, project by project. The third conversation, as you can see there, is a conversation around opportunities for growth, which is pretty much the typical performance review type conversation that we have. Of course, we have to talk about that, but we don't have to only talk about that. That's the point. And again, I would be asking that person to come to that conversation having thought about that, rather than me sitting there, or Mark or anyone else, you know, us telling them what they need to work on. How about we give them some accountability for that as well? Now, out of those 2 conversations, it's likely that there'll be a whole lot of learning opportunities that will come out of that, and that's where conversation 4 comes in. This is your learning and development conversation. So we can bring all that in together. And of course, learning is not always about sending people off to a course, an AIM course or something. It could well be about mentoring. It could be about, showing people how to do things more effectively. There's a range of ways that we can do that. And the final conversation there it is again, innovation and continuous improvement. So this is around what ideas that person's got to make the organisation or workplace more efficient and effective. Now, if you just simply implemented that concept once a month with your direct reports, it's likely that you will have a more engaged employee, all things being equal. So I originally put this together because I thought that the performance review wasn't a great idea, but ultimately people are now using it just as an engagement piece as well. So I just want to share with you a few little ideas before I hand over to Mark and just talk about some of the things that might just spark you to think differently about how you might create this environment that I mentioned earlier around engagement in your organisation. Because ultimately, we have some responsibility there, not all the responsibility, we have some. So what I'm going to do now is just got one question here. I think we'll leave that, if you don't mind, and we've got questions coming up later. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Mark and give him the opportunity to be the presenter. There we go.
Thanks, Tim. All right, one moment, folks. Here we go.
There we go.
All right. So again, thank you, Tim, and thank you for everyone for attending and showing interest in this topic. And just to reinforce what Tim said as a very kind introduction, I've had this view for a very, very long time that the sort of mechanics and the process and the concept of performance management and performance review just doesn't work, full stop. And Tim and I probably met about 10 years ago, I guess, Tim, roughly. And I think there was a synergy. So, I don't agree with 100% of what Tim says, but I agree with 90% of what he says. And I think that's a great starting point. And that's one of the things I want to focus on today is we don't have to agree on the mechanics of everything and apply a one-shoe-fits-all. But Tim and I think you've both heard strongly, or you've heard strongly from both of us, that we're really saying managing performance isn't the future. It's managing engagement. And quite interestingly, even some of the big IT companies that provide HR systems now talk about things like user experience and engagement rather than providing tools and methodologies, etc. So I wanted to start with just the definition you can see on the slide and focus on the difference between performance and engagement. And I want to flesh out a little bit going back to what Tim said with job descriptions and I want to pick up recruitment. We actually recruit for the red side of that, for the performance side, for the job description side, the technical side. It's very few companies that invest time, effort, and money into looking about engagement. And yet, the way the industrial legislation and the rules around managing people in the workplace have changed in the last 20 years or so, it's actually all about behaviour. And if you think of bullying, victimisation, harassment, they've got nothing to do with how well an individual performs on the job. They're all about the engagement, the emotional connection with the organisation, those issues. And I agree completely with Tim. It's not a one-sided story. We are sharing this view today about a culture, a value, a point of view that takes two sides. If leaders do this, there's the opportunity for employees to do it. But employees need to be part of the solution. There's just no question of that. So let me go back to introduce the performance improvement plan. I do want to spend a few moments talking about the traditional model. Now, this slide is just a way of representing a generic position. And we've got months down the bottom and some sort of scale of performance on the side. So my argument here is that for a period of time, the person is performing. Now, yes, one would like that line that's at 50% to go higher, but at least it's performing, they're doing their job, everyone's happy. Then at month 3 on that graph, performance starts to slide. Now, in my experience, I've yet to meet a manager that hasn't attempted to address the problems when it starts to slide. Every time a manager comes to me and says, I'm having a problem with Fred, they have made some attempt to resolve it themselves. If anyone can tell me that I'm wrong or they've got an experience that's otherwise, delighted to know, please let me know. But my point is, we have to accept that people have attempted to solve the problem. Now, unfortunately, on my graph there at about month 5, the performance improvement process, the PIP, kicks in. Why? Because that's the only tool we teach the HR people from university onwards. There's people like Tim and I that write books and do a few other things to suggest an alternative. But the way the students are taught is fundamentally built around, this is the way you resolve problems. And it talks about performance, not engagement. So the top 4 or 5 dot points there are stock standard out of the textbook. What people suggest are the methodologies that you need, or the parts, the components. Set SMART goals. Everyone knows, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, etc. And most importantly, time-based, the T. So the principle is you've got to give people time to improve. And yet we saw on the top of the graph, they can do the job. If they can do the job and something's changed and they're no longer performing at the same standard, that's definition that they know how to do their job. So therefore, that's not the problem. We're addressing the wrong problem. Regular check-ins. I know organisations that mandate, as part of that PIP process, 1 hour, 2 hour meetings every week for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. For someone that knows how to do their job, what are we spending in that amount of time? And as Tim said, we're both on about productivity, performance improvement, etc. The last 2 dot points are the ones I want to really focus on. I have yet to meet anyone in the last, say, decade who said either they're involved in or they've been the respondent of a PIP process. And every one of them says it's just an ass protecting process for the organisation. I know my job's in jeopardy. Now, if someone's not doing their job, we're not talking about engagement, we're talking about kicking them out the door. And then we spend hours and hours and weeks doing this. It's just dumb. And the bottom dot point is the most important one as well. It's a very adversarial model. Everyone knows it. It doesn't come across that way. And I'll have a lot of arguments with people when I say that, but at the end of the day, I'm arguing it's an adversarial model. And it's not based on engagement. There's nothing in that process that practically says, let's help the person get back on top. I love this slide. It's a book, a HR textbook from 10 years ago. I know you probably can't quite read the detail. You don't need to. You just need to focus on the fact that there are 29 decision points. And my argument is that's 29 opportunities to get it wrong. Not meaning to, but you'll make a mistake. And worse, 5 of those mistakes mean you go back and start again. No wonder PIPs can take 12 months or more. It's a completely flawed design. And if we introduce things like unions and lawyers and that legal adversarial model into that model, they are always looking to find fault with the process and the decision points. No wonder managers don't like it. It's just not exactly a smart model. But imagine if I was a consultant taking that to an organisation and said, I've got the best performance improvement plan process for you. It's straight out of the textbook. It's going to cost us 50 grand to implement. And there are 29 steps every time it goes wrong. And 5 of them you have to start again. Do you want to sign up? Because that's really what it's saying. So Tim and I both agree that there's got to be a smarter way. So we have something that we've developed over many, many years called PRP, or Proactive Re-Engagement Program. So again, this is where Tim and I wanted to put this presentation together and talk to you about do all the good things, do the 5 conversations model or equivalent. Focus on the non-job roles and the behaviours. That's really critically important in any organisation. But if it goes a bit pear-shaped, you can see that I've got 3 different coloured lines here and they're all marked out. And the whole idea is we want people to go back up to the level of performance. However, if they're not going to, I respect that, and they need to go out the door. Right? I don't have a problem with that. So the difference here is we are actually focusing on the unacceptable behaviour, or as Tim called it, the non-job components. Because we know that people can actually do the technical components, right? And the second dot point there is absolutely fundamentally critical as far as I'm concerned. Just because someone is playing up like a pork chop, or as Tim described, a technical person who doesn't want to be part of a team or whatever, my first question is, so what? What is the business problem? Because if you don't have a business problem, why are you all running around getting upset by this thing? So my very simple example is someone's always late. All right, fine. We know that, you can document that, there's records, etc., etc. But what is the problem when they're late? So a classic case was in a coal mine. For those that are familiar, they have what they call the pickup truck, and they have what they call a hot seat changeover. So the diggers and the trucks and all the big gear, they run 24/7, and someone ferries the staff around. One of the supervisors ferries the staff. They drop off the new person for the shift, pick up the other person. Well, they had one particular employee who was always habitually late. And the problem was the supervisor had to do 2 runs, right? And once we identified that, we identified the behaviour, we identified the problem, we had this type of conversation, and he immediately, and that's the point, he immediately changed his behaviour. Because if he didn't, he knew he was out the door, right? So by focusing on the problem, we don't need to give people that T as part of the SMART goals. There is no need for time. This is not about you can't do the job, you need to reskill. This is about your non-job components, as Tim put it, the behaviours. And therefore, you can create a document and a process that basically says, here's what's going on, which is the behaviour. Here's the problem that it causes in the workplace. Here's the solution that we've agreed to, and it's going to start immediately. And that's worked really, really well. Now, the bottom part there is something I'd like everybody that's listening to focus on. You don't have to be perfect. You're allowed to make some human mistakes, and I'm now talking the sort of legal side of it, the Fair Work Australia, the lawyers, etc. Right? As long as you are reasonable in your approach, then you're okay. So in summary, what I've got here before I hand back to Tim is a process that says, I love everything Tim's talking about, and I encourage everyone to have those conversations regularly, to keep on top of things regularly. However, we all know that sometimes, for whatever reason, people are going to become disengaged. I've certainly been there in my past. But when we're disengaged, I very strongly urge you to think about this process, the PRP process, not the PIP process. And the reason being, this works. And what I've found from my experience is when we give this tool as an adjunct to what Tim's talking about, managers have confidence that they know if it starts to go wobbly, I will get the right support from the right people, and therefore we can continue to move forward with the good group and the rest of it, and not be worried and concerned about either A, taking 6 or 12 months to solve a problem, or B, losing in court. So that's my contribution to this conversation. But Tim and I have structured this so that we're actually going to pass back to Tim now and go into a sort of a discussion between Tim and I. Oops, I didn't want that, sorry. I've got to click the wrong button. So I've got to make Tim the presenter. There we go. It's back to you, Tim.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Mark. We've got a couple of questions here, Mark, and I've got one here. We might as well sort of kick the ball off.
Yep.
So what I think you've sort of answered this one, but someone asks, why do people stick to PIP? Why do they feel they need to stick to it?
Look, it's an incredibly valid question, and it's one I've struggled with for many years, and the answer is simple. It's the only tool that mainstream business knows. It is what is taught at the universities. It is what the lawyers encourage. And partly that is because the lawyers also come through the university model. So that's the answer is, it's like we had manual cars until someone invented an automatic gearbox. It's that different, that's all it is. So the answer to your question is, until these ideas that Tim and I are talking about become a little more mainstream, people are not being taught or shown that there's an alternative.
So they don't know, basically, Mark.
They don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, right. And so they get into this legal sort of issue, and as you've alluded to, and all of us in this presentation would know, very rarely does it work. So we get disillusioned with it.
If your goal is to improve performance, then statistically speaking, 90% of the time it doesn't work.
Yeah, and yet that's the only thing.
If your goal is to protect the organisation from unfair dismissal, it still only works about 50% of the time.
So I've got another question here, Mark, around, so what sort of conversations do people have to have that are more relevant than the current PIP conversations? What works for you?
What works is the sorts of methodology that Tim was talking about with his 5 conversations framework. Simple, and what I say about that is, Tim and I have had discussions about the headings he has on his conversations, and I can agree to disagree with Tim on a particular nuance of that. But the point is, those sorts of day-to-day conversations, as Tim said, improve engagement. There's no question of that.
Yeah.
So they're the starting points to answer this question. My answer is, when those conversations don't get the performance/engagement to where you want it to be, that is the trigger that you need to do something different. And what I'm offering is something different that works. So the simple answer to the question is, I would encourage you to do what Tim's talking about. And when that no longer works, that becomes the trigger. And you can't be really specifically black and white about when it no longer works.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, look, I've just got a question from John, and it's a good question here around an assumption here is that the leader has a developed emotional intelligence capacity to navigate the non-technical aspects. Do you agree? I might just kick the ball off there, and Mark, you add. Look, it's true, John, but look, let me just come back to some fundamentals here. I don't think, and this might sound controversial, that having conversations is really an art form. A lot of us think it is, but it's not really. You know why? Because we're used to having them every single day. Now, I would say that difficult conversations do require a skill set, undoubtedly. But I would say that any conversations, generally speaking, are not an art form. They don't require a huge emotional intelligence. Now, having said that, it's surprising to me how many people will think otherwise. In fact, I have a lot of people say to me, look, we love your 5 conversations framework, but we need to have some training in it before we implement it. I think it's really interesting. Imagine if your parents were still alive today and you said to them, guess what, we're having training to have conversations. I'd think that was the funniest thing they've ever heard in their life. That's how far removed we've become in terms of conversations. Now, I would actually argue that having the conversations themselves is the training. So you throw yourself in the deep end. Mark made the point about, you're going to make mistakes and things aren't perfect. I think people should, in many ways, jump in. I mean, you can sit there in front of a class and listen to how, structure around how you do it. You have to actually get in and do it. And, that's just my 2 cents worth. But yes, I do accept the proposition, John, that, there is an assumption that people have got this emotional intelligence capacity. But at the end of the day, when we put people into leadership roles, the big problem, of course, is that we get, we say, okay, they've got the technical skills, so they're good engineers, so they make a good leader. Well, we all know that's not the case. So I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we promote people into leadership roles as well, John. I'd make that point as well. So, Mark, comments?
Yeah, John, I'd add another dimension which you didn't quite ask, but I suspect is embedded in your question. And that is, if we're having these conversations, one, do we need a record? And two, why do we need a record? And I don't want to go into the detail, but my criticism of the answer to those two questions is very often corporate wants to know something, or HR wants to know that you've had the conversation, and they want to know what you had the conversation for. I'm totally adverse to that. I think that's, unless you can make that really simple and, you know, sort of put it on an app on your phone, don't get carried away about the paperwork. Because the moment you do, you're going down, again, what Tim called the technical side of the job requirement, not the engagement side. So I would be very, very strong, and sorry, back to how it fits with my conversations. I don't mind if there's no documentation when it gets to having the difficult conversation, because we'll start again. We'll say, well, what's the bad behaviour? What's the problem? Okay, what is the evidence? Now, if the evidence is, you know, someone can't run a meeting, then there's 3 or 4 people in the meeting that we can go and ask. So I think, John, my answer to your question is stick to the conversation, not the bureaucracy and the paperwork.
Yeah, I agree totally, Mark. I think that I've worked in a lot of organisations that said, oh, we've got to document everything. Why?
No.
The whole issue is around engaging and connecting with the person. And, you know, if you went to a coffee shop with your friend, you wouldn't be sitting there taking notes. Now, I'm not suggesting it's the same thing, but think about it this way. And you would say, well, how will I remember what they've said? Well, I would say just listen. You know, that's a good start.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, every now and again you might want to jot down something, but I think about this. When you're sitting with someone and they're taking notes, what are you thinking? You're thinking, well, I wonder what they're writing down. That's the first thing. And secondly, it detracts from the actual connection in the conversation.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I did a job recently for a very large IT department in an organisation, and we implemented the 5 conversations framework, and the morale was absolutely awful. And you know, we had this big debate, should we, you know, take notes and all the rest, and we made the decision not to. And of course, we looked at the before and after surveys around the 5 conversations framework, and guess what? It was fantastic. It was, and not a note was taken. So it's all about the engagement. When I say engagement in this sense, I'm talking about the engagement in the conversation as such. So I think, you know, it's true that you need some, you know, some basic skills around this, but I think if we start going around saying it's some great art form, then clearly we're going to steer clear of it and think it's just too hard. But I think, you know, if a leader can't have a conversation with their direct reports, then it's a bit of a concern. And the question might be, well, you know, why are they in the leadership role in the first place if they can't sit there and talk to them? 2 colleagues of mine in the United States, Jim Kuzner and Barry Posner, who wrote a great book called Credibility, argue that leadership is a relationship. I think that's brilliant. Leadership is a relationship. And then, of course, my rhetorical question is, how do you have a relationship? And there's only one particular way, and that is one conversation at a time. There's no other way. So, you know, the idea that, you know, you can have a relationship via text or email bouncing, well, maybe, but not really. So it's about having these regular catch-ups and conversations that are critically important. But, yeah, it's a really interesting topic. And in fact, we've just got a question on this around...
Sorry, before you move on, Tim, could I add another tiny bit to John, just an analogy that I like to use. And it's our dental hygiene, cleaning our teeth. We can all use a toothbrush. We can all floss. Some of us do and don't. Some of us clean our teeth more than the other. And occasionally, maybe annually or every couple of years, we might go to the dentist just for a checkup. Now, show me one person in the world that has a complete record of all of that stuff. And the answer is no one. But if we wake up one morning with a sore tooth, we go into the dentist, he doesn't ask for all those records before he or she opens our mouth. They just go, let's have a look at the problem and solve it. And I think that's an analogy of what is the answer to your question. Let's keep this stuff simple. Let's keep it relational based. Let's keep it human based. And let the system cut in if it gets a little bit hard. So sorry, Tim, next question.
No, that's good. Keith's just asking, I think this is probably one I can deal with initially, but I think I'd like to hear Mark's point of view too. Should we prepare people prior to starting conversations so that they're ready to talk freely? This way they are not guarded. Yes, look, if we're looking at the 5 conversations framework, I actually, for example, if you look at conversation 5, which is innovation and continuous improvement. If I said to someone, what's an area we can basically improve? And they're sitting, don't know. Well, that's not going to be worth having a conversation about because they haven't thought about it. So I actually like the idea of letting people know what we're going to be talking about, at least with the 5 conversations framework, so that when they come, they've actually thought about the answers. And I think that's a good thing. I want them to think about the answers, and it can improve that. And I think sometimes managers feel a bit insecure about that. But really, if I'm going in to talk to my boss, I'd like to know at least what he or she wants to talk to me about. That's a good start. But secondly, I wouldn't even mind knowing what sort of topics will be covered. That'll give me a sense of psychological safety. And not only that, I'll probably be more confident and have more to say. So the answer, Keith, is, well, certainly with the 5 conversations, I'll give Mark an opportunity in a moment. But the answer from my point of view is, yes, I think it's good to let people know what you're going to ask them. Absolutely. What do you think, Mark?
100% agree, full stop. My only additional comment, Keith, is, as I've already argued, keep it simple. You don't need a 5-page introductory document to say you're going to have a conversation on learning opportunities. You just need to say learning opportunities. You could talk about these 3 dot points. End of story.
Yeah, good point. Now, I'm at the risk of offending any lawyers that are in our audience, Mark. I have to tell a little analogy just around this. I was working in a large law firm, and we introduced this conversation model that we've been talking about. And just to highlight what Mark's talking about, I'm basically giving them training to, how does this work and what questions can you ask and all the rest of it, which is just par for the course. One of the partners, of course, it'll remain nameless, but it's just an interesting little anecdote. One of the partners said at this stage, this sounds very artificial. Remember, they're in an audience of, say, 40 to 50 people. And he said, it sounds very artificial. And I said, what do you mean by artificial? And he said, I don't feel comfortable just sitting there reading out these questions. And of course, everyone was shuffling in their seat and a bit embarrassed, and being in a public forum, I had to deal with that fairly delicately. But I basically said, it's not a question of you reading out the questions and then giving them an opportunity to respond. The questions are just a guideline. They're just because the conversations are, go off on tangents in different ways. That's not a bad thing. So, yeah, it's funny how people might think that, to get this absolutely right, we've got to produce 10 questions and we've got to hand this to the other person. No, not necessarily. Just as Mark said, just some guidelines around where we go from this. And very much, of course, focused on the performance issue, which is what Mark is talking about. So, Mark, have you got a comment about that?
Again, only to reinforce that each of, the idea of Tim's 5 conversations model is just have simple 5-minute, nice, easy, friendly, regular chats, right? End of story. And I absolutely 100% endorse that. The other thing I like about it is the traditional performance review. Well, again, going back to my slides, why are we reviewing performance that is already acceptable, at least?
Yeah.
But it's illogical to me to be looking backwards. Now, there is one good reason, and sorry, Keith, we're probably answering your question the long way around, but you know me. If you're talking about reward and bonuses and a few things like that, yes, you need to know that some hard targets have been set. I'd suggest strongly that that's less than 10% of your workforce. You know, there's a whole bunch of people that just want to come to work, do a good job. They're not going to be rocket scientists. They're not going to change the world, but they're doing good stuff for you, right? This is a great model for just having those little friendly chats and keeping them engaged. It's almost a maintenance model. Now, my argument is you don't need a lot of bureaucracy around that. You don't need a lot of structure. You need a bit. But as I say, if you know, using my slide, if the performance starts to drop off, then let's start a new type of conversation. And if you want to do reward and remuneration based on some KPIs and stuff, that's a separate conversation. That could be a sixth conversation in Tim's model. But yeah, the whole idea of what Tim and I are saying is you want engagement, talk to your people. Is that fair enough, Tim?
Absolutely. Yeah, look, we've got a number of HR people in the audience, and I just want to make a couple of comments. I think you'll probably, please respond to me in the audience if you disagree, but at the end of the day, an organisation is just a bunch of individuals working towards a common cause.
Yep.
Sometimes what happens is we lose sight of this and we get bogged down in logistics and KPIs and Scooby-Doos and all sorts of things. What we actually need to do is just to remind ourselves of that. Now, that's not necessarily meaning that we need to go soppy on people, because sometimes you've got to have a hard conversation with people, and I think that's fair and reasonable at the appropriate time and in the right way. But at the end of the day, if we're trying to get the best out of people, which is ultimately what all of us are trying to do, then we've just got to connect with them as human beings. And the vehicle, the vehicle that's hugely underrated but are highly effective, is a one-on-one conversation. And so if you get nothing else out of our presentation today, it's just to remind yourselves of the regular need to have check-ins with your people. During these I don't mind if you use the 5 conversations frame or whatever. These check-ins, they're not about, oh, while I'm here, let me talk about Project X. No, this is not about Project X, because you're going to talk about Project X anyway in the corridor or wherever. This is about developmental and performance conversations, you know, around how people can do things better. So it staggers me that people often think this is going to be a huge imposition on time. Let me assure you, from my experience, you put in a little bit of effort having these regular check-ins and you will get enormously good results, because it's not quite so tangible, but you'll just notice that people will be coming to you things that they should be coming to you. There's a better rapport. You've got better communication going on your team, all sorts of things that we're all aiming to do anyway. So to me, and those of you in HR, I'm sure, you know, we are very guilty of complicating things. Let's just come back to fundamentals. It's as often a good thing. Yes, there needs to be a few recordings and things, of course, as Mark said, and obviously we need systems and processes and things in place, frameworks, whatever. But let's not get all bogged down in, you know, PIPs and all sorts of stuff that, frankly, probably doesn't work, or shouldn't say probably, it doesn't work. So let's just get back to fundamentals, and I think that is critically important with people. Yeah, critically important, actually.
And can I add to that, again, to the HR folk that are listening to us here today? Whether you call it a performance review, a PDR, a planning and development, you know, whatever your phrase is for your current process and document, I would really ask you to have a close look at it and say, what information are we catching and why? What are we going to do with it? And what you'll find that it's probably a mix of all those 5 things that Tim had on his PD slide or his job description slide. Some technical stuff, probably some KPIs, learning opportunities, etc., etc. I argue that that's a really complicated process, and it really doesn't add a lot of value. In fact, my anecdotal evidence says that it adds zero value, right? But it takes a lot of time. Now, I don't think Tim and I are saying that managing performances should be thrown out. Far from it. What we're saying is that the methods and the processes we use can be a lot smarter, a lot more efficient, a lot better. So, you know, if we put on the negative side performance reviews and PIPs, then on the positive side, we're suggesting things like simple day-to-day conversations and PRPs when it goes a bit pear-shaped. And I think that's the key message that I'd certainly like to get across for this presentation and ask you people to have a think about that.
Yeah, good point, Mark. It's not about going soft on performance. It's just doing things slightly differently or very differently in some cases. I've just got a question here from Francis, and I'll read it out because it's a little long. I don't want to get it wrong. How do you as a manager best deal with the question from other employees who keep questioning what they perceive as a problem with another employee? All right, I get what you mean. For example, an employee may not always arrive on time, which they have an issue with, but employee leaves late and rarely takes a full hour for lunch. So, Mark, what do you think about that one?
This comes back to, sorry, who was the question from?
Francis.
Sorry, Francis. As far as I'm concerned, excellent question. Now, my approach to that would be, again, following my model. What simple conversations have you, as the manager, and I'll just assume this is you for this conversation, have you had with both the person and their co-workers? Because if you focus on the business, and by the way, I've been in exactly the same boat that you're talking about in the past. If you start to focus on, well, look, Mary does come in late, but she stays late and gets the work done, I think Tim and I would agree what you're doing is opening up the conversation where other people go, actually no, because she misses the morning meetings, or when she's in it late, other things are happening that we don't know about. So there's very often a subtle dynamic that you have to unpick and find out, well, what is the business problem? So that's my response to your question is, think carefully about, is it unacceptable behaviour? And if it is it causing a business problem? Now, if you have your conversation with your team around that, hopefully that will give you some suggested alternate ways to think about it. The other comment I'd make is, let us assume that this person is having inappropriate behaviour and is causing problems. I will guarantee you fixing that one problem will just lift the engagement of the rest of the team through the roof. People look to leaders and managers to deal with these problems. My criticism, and I think Tim's criticism, is we don't give you the right tools. So that was the conversation we wanted to have today is, yes, there is another tool. There is another way. So hopefully I'll pass back to you, Tim. You can add to that.
No, thanks, Mark. No, I totally agree. And so you know, to look at about, is it a business problem? That's a key point. Secondly, have regular check-ins around development. These are probably the two things that we're suggesting most of all. I think if you do those things, you're creating the environment where engagement can increase. And of course, it's up to the individual on the receiving end.
Correct.
So, folks, we're just about done. So I think, you know, thank you for your involvement. Thank you for the questions. Very, very great engagement. It was really motivating to be involved today. And what we'll do now is I'll send you out a copy of the slides, a copy of the recording, so you'll get all of that. So keep your eyes peeled in your inbox. If you'd like to talk to Mark about his approach, please do. Mark will welcome that and an opportunity to work with you if necessary. And of course, if you want to talk about the 5 conversations, I'm more than happy as well to engage with any of you in this process. So one thing I want to say to everyone, happy Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. As I said at the outset, it's been a really interesting year, let's say that. And we're all hoping, of course, that 2021 will be a better year. So on that note, we'll say goodbye and look forward to engaging with you from here on in. Thanks, everyone. All the best and goodbye.
All the best. Merry Christmas.